They told him the forest would swallow any man who dared return, and now he finally understands why. A worn-out veteran came back to Duluth with nothing but his loyal German shepherd and a pocketful of regrets. He thought the old family house was just another frozen ruin. But the moment his dog began growling at the cracked basement wall, everything changed. Behind that crumbling brick was a hidden box sealed by a soldier's hands decades earlier. What he found inside didn't just reopen old wounds. It revealed a secret that could rewrite everything the town believed about that long-forgotten winter. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. Let's see how far this story reaches. Winter pressed its weight on Duluth, the kind of cold that made the sky feel heavy and the air brittle enough to crack. John Harrison guided his rusted blue pickup down London Road, the tires crunching over old snow hardened into ridges by weeks of sub-zero nights. At 68, John carried the look of a man carved by weather and war, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a chest that had begun to stoop, as if the years had placed a permanent hand on his back. His face, once sharply cut, was now softened by age, but still marked by deep lines around the eyes, trenches etched by worry-grief, and battles both fought and avoided. His beard, a rugged mix of gray and fading brown, framed a mouth that rarely smiled. His eyes were a pale winter blue cold, when distant warm only when the past tricked him into remembering the version of himself he once hoped to be. Beside him lay Max, his German shepherd of nearly 12 years. The dog's thick coat, once a bold saddle of black over tan, was now peppered with white around the muzzle and along his spine. Max was tall for his breed, strong legs, chest wide like a small mountain ears always perked unless exhaustion betrayed his age. His eyes were amber and deeply expressive, holding a gentleness that contrasted with the military-like discipline in the way he sat moved and observed the world. John had found him abandoned outside an outpost in New Mexico years ago, a puppy trembling from cold and hunger, ears too big for his head. They had been inseparable ever since, and John often wondered if Max saved him more times than he saved the dog. Duluth rose before them, perched along the frozen edge of Lake Superior, like a survivor refusing to leave the battlefield. Snow clung stubbornly to rooftops, weighed down pine branches, and frosted every window along the steep hillside roads. The air smelled of iron lake water and distant chimney smoke, the scent of a place that had endured more winters than hope. John drove slowly through the streets, letting the familiarity seep into him like a slow ache. Every corner held a memory he wasn't sure he wanted. There was the old bakery now shut down where his mother used to buy him warm cranberry scones. The harbor steel gray and restless where his father once worked hauling lumber onto barges. And the bus stop where he'd stood 22 years old, gripping a military duffel bag, believing he was headed toward a life bigger than the one waiting at home. He'd never imagined he would return older, poorer, and broken in ways no one could see from the outside. "Almost there, buddy," he murmured. Max lifted his head, nudging John's elbow with a soft grunt that said he understood. The dog always understood. John turned onto a narrow street that wound uphill toward his family's old neighborhood. The houses here were small-built, close together, weather-beaten but stubborn. Snow packed the sidewalks and icicles hung from gutter edges like cold glass fangs. His stomach tightened as he parked in front of a sagging, blue-shingled house with a roofline that dipped like tired shoulders. The Harrison home, or what was left of it. He stared at it for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles paled. The last time he'd stood on that porch, his father had been alive, red-cheeked from the cold, asking why his son couldn't stay just a little longer before deployment. John had refused, believing duty demanded distance from home. Months later, a heart attack took his father in that same living room. John had been too far away to say goodbye. Guilt, like an old wound, pulsed inside him. Max let out a low whine, sensing the shift in his master's breathing. "I know," John whispered. "It's been a long time." He stepped out of the truck boots, sinking into snow piled nearly a foot high. The cold slapped his face, a burning shock that traveled through his lungs as he exhaled a visible cloud. Max followed closely, paws crunching softly beside him. The paint on the house had peeled away, revealing gray, tired wood beneath. The windows were clouded with grime. The porch steps sagged, their edges crumbling. Something inside John twisted painfully. He had always meant to come back sooner. But life had a way of stretching one more year into decades. As he mounted the steps, testing each one carefully, the door creaked in the wind. He pulled the key from his coat pocket, faded, scratched warm, from being held too long in a clenched fist. When it slid into the lock and turned easily, John felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the scent of dust and forgotten seasons. The living room was nearly empty, just a toppled chair, an old table covered with sheets and curtains faded to the color of old bone. Dust floated in the slanted morning light. Max sniffed the corner's tail, low paws, silent. He was alert, but not afraid. John walked deeper inside, every step stirring memories he'd long buried. The scars inside him throbbed, not the physical ones from shrapnel or desert heat, but the invisible ones from loneliness, choices made, and years spent running from himself. He entered the kitchen. The counters were cracked, the cabinets warped. Yet he could still picture his mother standing there, apron tied neatly, hair in a loose blonde bun, humming old folk songs. She had been a petite woman with warm hazel eyes and a smile that softened even the hardest days. Her sudden death alone in this very house was the ache he never spoke of. Max suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked sharply. He walked to the basement door and pawed at it once, then twice. John frowned. "What is it, boy?" Max growled, not out of fear, but alertness. John opened the basement door. Cold air rose from below, carrying a stale, earthy smell. He flicked the light switch. "Nothing," Great John muttered. He retrieved a flashlight from his jacket and descended the wooden steps, each creaking under his weight. Max followed, sticking close to his side. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, rusted tools, and stacks of newspapers fossilized by time. But Max didn't care about any of it. The dog went straight to the far wall, nose pressed against a crack running along the concrete. John knelt beside him, shining the light on the wall. The crack widened toward the floor, as though something behind it had been pushing outward for years. He felt the concrete with his fingertips. It was strangely hollow. A strange unease slid down his spine. He leaned closer, examining the crack again. The edges were irregular, not from natural decay, but from something deliberately hidden. Max nudged his shoulder tail, stiff body tense but focused. "What the hell?" John whispered. The silence in the basement felt too heavy, too deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath. John stepped back, heart thumping harder than he expected. He suddenly felt the weight of the years, the unanswered questions, the ghosts that had lived in this house longer than he had ever stayed. Max pressed against him, warm and steady, grounding him. Something was behind that wall. Something someone had once meant to hide. As the cold crept through John's coat, he realized this return was not going to be the simple sail he had planned. Duluth hadn't just waited for him, it had kept something for him. Something buried. Something forgotten. Something that was about to change everything. And standing in the dim basement light, John Harrison understood he was no longer just a man coming home. He was a man standing on the edge of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Snow drifted lightly across the backyard as John stepped outside, the cold brushing against his face with the sharpness of a blade. The house behind him groaned under the weight of its own decay, every board and nail speaking of years left untouched. Max followed closely, his breath forming soft clouds in the icy air, as he halted beside the old wooden shed leaning against the far tree line. The shed seemed to be holding itself together out of stubbornness more than structure. Its roof bowed in the center, and the once red planks had faded into a patchwork of gray and peeling scars. John remembered helping his father stack firewood inside it decades ago, back when his hands were younger and steadier, back before the world had hardened parts of him he couldn't get back. Now the padlock on the door looked out of place, too new, too clean. It gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, sharp and unweathered, as if someone had been here not so long ago. John frowned. "This lock wasn't here when I left," he murmured to Max. The dog sniffed at the ground, tail low, ears forward, alert, curious but not alarmed. Max had a habit of becoming very still when something was wrong, and right now his posture was tense but controlled. That meant mystery, not danger. John tugged on the lock. Solid, heavy. The kind used for storage units or construction sites, not backyard sheds. After a minute of wrestling with the door, he stepped back and examined the hinges. Rusted, brittle. The lock didn't matter. The hinges would give way. John lifted his boot and kicked beneath the hinge. A crack split the quiet. Another kick louder. At the third, the hinge tore free with a screech, the door swinging inward. The smell hit him instantly, stale timber dust, and the faint metallic tang of something long forgotten. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the dim interior. Cobwebs hung like drapes. Stacks of mildewed boxes lined the walls. But Max wasn't interested in any of that. The dog walked straight to the back corner, nose pressed to the floorboards, tail stiff. "You smell something?" John asked. Max pawed once, then twice, and let out a sharp bark that seemed to rise from deep in his chest. The floorboards, unlike the rest of the shed, were newer, lighter in color and unwarped. Recently replaced. Kneeling, John pressed his fingers along the seam between the boards. There was a gap, small but deliberate. He grabbed a crowbar from a broken toolbox and wedged it under the boards. It took every bit of strength in his tired shoulders, but eventually the plank snapped upward with a dull crack. Beneath it was a small cavity lined with sheet metal to protect against moisture. Inside lay a military ammunition box, olive drab, dented at the corners, its latch still intact. The paint had chipped, but the stenciled letters remained readable: Harrison T.J., U.S. Army. John froze. His throat tightened. He knew the initials, every curve, every serif. Thomas Jeremiah Harrison, his father. A man built like a lumber beam, tall and sturdy with dark brows and a hawkish nose. A man who smoked cherry tobacco and believed that silence was better than unnecessary words. A man whose life had been shaped by the Korean War and the toll it left. A toll he passed down to his only son without meaning to. John exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected this. He had not expected anything his father left behind to still exist, much less be hidden. With shaking fingers, he lifted the box out of the cavity. Max sat beside him, leaning into his knee. "It's okay," John murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring, Max or himself. He unlatched the box. The metal groaned softly. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its edges cracked, its pages creased and yellowed. Resting beneath it was a folded piece of thick paper, rough hand-drawn with faint markings that looked like topographic lines. A map. John unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded in spots, but the route was clear, a path leading from the outskirts of Duluth deep into the Superior National Forest, ending at a point marked with a simple X. An X that meant something only soldiers seemed to understand. A promise, a burial, a secret. Or all three. John's chest tightened. He had heard his father speak only once of a winter patrol years before John was born, where something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, and left scars his father never described. Some things his father had said belonged to the snow, and some promises only a soldier keeps. John had always assumed it was a story worn thin by time, but this map, hidden, protected, said otherwise. He turned to the journal and opened to the first page. The handwriting was thick, bold, exactly how his father spoke, every letter a statement. "If you're reading this, then winter has brought you back." John swallowed. His throat felt scraped raw. He skimmed further down the page, past brief mentions of cold nights in Korea, men lost to storms, and an officer named Daniels whom his father once described as the kind of man who could make a mountain move with just a stare. The deeper he read, the more his pulse quickened. Words like hunted, buried, and don't let Crow find it leapt from the page. Crow. His father had written that name 35 years before Harlan Crow, the man now controlling half the land in Duluth, had ever risen to power. John's brows furrowed. Had Crow's father been involved, or his grandfather? What did his family want with a map locked away by his father? Max nudged his elbow, breaking the spiral of thoughts. "Right," he whispered. "Focus." He lifted his flashlight again, sweeping it across the shed. Another detail snagged his attention. Footprints. Not Max's. Not his. Smaller, lighter. A person who had been here recently, days, maybe hours ago. And not just one print. 2 sets. His heart tightened. Someone else knew about the shed. Someone else knew about the box. A twig snapped outside. Max's ears shot up. John stiffened, gripping the box against his chest, pulse thudding hard enough to feel in his fingertips. But when he stepped out, the yard was empty, nothing but swirling snow and the faint whisper of wind. Whoever had been there was gone, or hiding. John locked the shed door from the inside, barricading it with 2 old boards, before heading back toward the house, Max walking inches from his side. The journal and map pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He wasn't sure what he had inherited, truth, danger, or both, but one thing was clear: this wasn't simply a forgotten family relic. This was a calling, a whisper from a father who had carried a burden too heavy to speak aloud. As John stepped back into the frozen house and shut the door behind him, he understood that whatever lay in those woods, someone else wanted it too. And unlike him, they weren't coming back for answers. They were coming back to finish something. Something that began long before John ever left Duluth. The house creaked. Max stood guard by the basement door, and John Harrison knew there was no turning back now. The morning cold hit like a blade, sharp and metallic in the air. Duluth's winter was unforgiving, but the forest bordering Lake Superior carried a deeper kind of chill, the kind that settled into bone and memory. John Harrison tightened the straps of his worn canvas pack, the map folded inside his coat like a second heartbeat. Max stood beside him, tail stiff, breath rising in small white clouds as he waited for the signal to move. The dog's coat was thicker in winter, his black and tan fur puffed slightly at the neck, making him look broader, almost wolf-like in the dim morning light. John eyed the tree line rising before them, a jagged wall of pine and birch encased in ice. He had walked into dangerous places before, jungles, deserts, back alleys of foreign cities. But this forest felt different. It felt expectant, as if it had been waiting for him far longer than he'd known about the map folded against his chest. "All right, Max," he murmured. "Lead the way." Max lowered his head and began moving paws, silent in the powdery snow. His tail remained level, the sign he was tracking, not prey, not danger, but something unfamiliar and important. John followed, breath tightening in his lungs with every step. His knees ached, his lower back stiffened, and memories surfaced unbidden nights spent on cold ground overseas, where sleep was shallow and fear curled around his ribs. In the distance, Lake Superior's wind swept through the trees carrying a whistling note that sounded almost human. He quickened his pace. The map had shown a rough trail leading north into government-owned land. The further they moved, the thicker the forest became, branches bowing with the weight of snow. Max kept his nose close to the ground, occasionally pausing to sniff the air, his ears pivoting like radar dishes. John trusted the dog more than any compass he had ever used. 3 hours passed. The sun rose only enough to stain the sky pale yellow above the treetops, but its heat never reached them. Frost formed on John's beard, tiny ice crystals clinging to the gray strands like winter flowers. He stopped only once to drink from a metal flask lukewarm coffee with a hint of bitterness. It tasted like every morning he'd ever spent alone. Eventually, the forest opened into a small clearing. There, slanted against a half-fallen birch tree, stood a wooden cabin, if it could still be called that. The roof sagged inward. The door hung crooked. The logs forming the walls had cracked and darkened from decades of storms. Max trotted ahead, sniffing eagerly. John felt the same pull in his stomach. The cabin matched the crude sketch his father had drawn in the journal, right down to the collapsed chimney. Someone had been here. Maybe long ago. Maybe recently. John approached cautiously, his boots sinking deep with every step. He reached the porch, 3 rotting boards arranged more by memory than structure. Then he heard it. A branch snapping in the forest behind him. He froze. Max growled low, the fur along his spine rising. John turned slowly. Nothing but trees. But the silence felt too heavy, too deliberate. Not the natural stillness of a winter morning, but a pause. A held breath. He opened the cabin door. Max rushed in first, his tail low stance prepared. Inside smelled of mildew, animal musk, and the faint lingering hint of smoke. A rusted stove sat in the corner, its pipe broken. A cot, little more than a frame, rested against the back wall. But there were impressions in the dust, footsteps, patterns dragged along the floor, and a circle cleared on the table where someone had once placed something heavy. Recently. John examined the table. Splinters had come loose around the edges. The marks formed a rectangle like an old crate or metal box. His pulse picked up. "Someone found something here before we did," he whispered. Max barked once, short, sharp, pulling John's attention to the floor. Near the corner, almost hidden beneath the collapsed cot, were tracks in the dust. Human tracks. John crouched. They were narrow, lightweight, suggesting someone younger, possibly in their 20s or 30s. The prints were too clean to be old. Maybe a day. Maybe a few hours. Max pawed again at the doorframe. More tracks outside. A second set, larger, heavier, belonging to someone with a longer stride. Whoever had been here wasn't alone. John stepped outside again, scanning the tree line. 2 sets of tracks circled the cabin. One had boots with thick treads, the kind used by hikers or rangers. The other left lighter prints, likely a woman's or a slender man's. They circled the clearing back and forth, stopping at windows, moving to the cabin door, then veering off toward a denser part of the forest. As if searching. As if tracking him. He clenched his jaw. The name he'd read in his father's journal whispered through his mind. Crow. And though he didn't yet understand the full connection, his instincts sharpened like a blade. He had been watched. Was still being watched. Max's ears perked again. This time he faced west. A faint sound emerged, soft steps on snow, too rhythmically spaced to be an animal. John gripped the strap of his pack, steadying his breath. A shadow appeared between the trees. A man stepped out, mid-40s, maybe older. He was tall, lean, but wiry, with a sharp nose, close-trimmed beard, and a scar running from his left temple to the corner of his jaw. A scar that looked surgically clean, not jagged. His hair was dark brown, peppered lightly with gray. His coat was thick, military style, and well-maintained, not the clothing of someone lost in the woods. Someone purposeful. His eyes cold gray, calculating, locked onto John immediately. The stranger lifted his hands slightly, palms visible, but only to show he carried no weapon openly. His voice when he spoke was low, roughened by wind and long winters. "Didn't expect anyone else to come out here." John's guard rose instantly. "You live around here?" The man offered a thin smile, not friendly but polite enough to disarm the unwary. "Name's Daniel Rourke," he said. "I'm with the county land survey team. We check these old structures every few years." John assessed him carefully. Daniel Rourke was too sharp in the eyes, too steady in his stance, too deliberate in his tone. He carried himself like someone used to giving orders or tracking things. And the scar spoke of a man who had survived things far worse than falling branches. Max didn't like him. The dog stepped forward, placing himself halfway between John and the stranger, growling softly in his chest. Rourke didn't flinch, but his eyes flicked to the dog with recognition. "Fine-looking shepherd you've got there," he remarked. "Rare to see one with a face that wise." John's voice remained cautious. "We're just passing through." Rourke nodded, eyes sweeping the cabin and the surrounding snow. Not the best day for sightseeing. The wind howled, suddenly bending pine branches until they creaked like ship timbers. Rourke stepped closer, boots silent in the snow. "Whatever you're looking for out here," he said quietly. "I'd turn back if I were you. Forest isn't kind to strangers." John met his gaze. "I'm not a stranger." Something flickered in Rourke's eyes, recognition, maybe even fear, but vanished too quickly to read. He tipped his head once, then stepped back toward the trees. "Suit yourself, Harrison." John felt his pulse stutter. "How do you know my name?" Rourke paused. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he turned halfway. His breath drifted in a white cloud. "Small town," he said. "Word gets around." And then he disappeared into the forest, his figure swallowed by white and shadow. John stood silent long after. Max pressed against his leg, trembling not with fear but readiness. The cabin creaked behind them, sending a whisper into the cold air as if urging them onward. John looked at the map again. The route continued deeper into the forest. Whoever the two strangers were, they were ahead of him now. And they knew his name. With the journal, the map, and Max at his side, John tightened his coat and headed north toward the place marked with an X, toward whatever truth his father had buried beneath snow and silence. Night fell with a violence that belonged only to the northern wilderness. The sky, once a pale winter blue, turned to iron, and the first gusts of the coming blizzard swept through the superior forest, with a scream sharp enough to rattle the branches overhead. Snow spiraled downward in frantic swarms, stinging John Harrison's cheeks as he tightened the drawstrings of his hood. Max pressed closer to him, the dog's thick fur bracing against the storm's first teeth. The wind grew louder, pushing at them like an unseen force intent on driving them back. John's breath left his mouth in clouds that were instantly torn apart. He knew this kind of weather, unpredictable, brutal, and capable of turning a simple misstep into a fatal mistake. "We need shelter," he muttered, scanning the tree line. Max whined in agreement. They had already traveled deeper into the forest than the map suggested, following faint tracks that likely belonged to the two mysterious visitors from the cabin. But now survival came before answers. The storm thickened with every heartbeat. Through the blowing snow, John caught sight of a faint glow, warm, flickering, impossible. Firelight. Max barked once short but alert, his posture shifting into a guarded stance. John gripped the strap of his pack and pushed forward. Branches whipped at his coat. Snow blinded his vision. But as they rounded a bend of old cedar trees, the source of the light became clear, a small wooden shelter wedged beneath a massive rock overhang, half hidden by snowdrifts. In front of it burned a fire protected behind a windbreak made of stacked logs. A figure crouched beside it, feeding the flames with quick, practiced motions. The man looked up the moment John stepped into the clearing. He rose slowly, cautious, but not afraid. He appeared to be in his early 30s, though hardship had marked him with lines deeper than his age deserved. He stood tall, lean, with long arms and broad shoulders, like someone who had spent years chopping wood and carrying his life on his back. His hair was a mass of dark curls that fell unevenly to his jawline, tangled by wind. A trimmed beard framed a face both solemn and alert, with high cheekbones, a sharp nose, and eyes the color of warm amber, soft in the fire's glow, yet shadowed by something old, something painful. His clothes were layers of mismatched survival gear, a heavy wool coat patched at the elbows, dark thermal pants tucked into battered boots wrapped with extra cloth. The man looked like the forest had raised him. "Storm's getting worse," he called over the wind. His voice was deep but cautious, carrying a slight rasp that hinted he didn't speak often. "If you stay out there, you'll freeze." Max stepped forward, ears pricked. The stranger didn't flinch. He only lowered his hand slowly, palm open, in a gesture of peace. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "I know you're kind. You can smell truth better than people can." John approached, keeping a protective arm slightly ahead of Max. "You alone out here?" The man nodded. "Been that way a long time." Then he hesitated before adding, "Name's Ethan. Ethan Miller." The surname struck something faint in John's memory, but he couldn't place it. Ethan's gaze flicked to John's face, studying him with quiet intensity. "You're Harrison, aren't you?" The cold inside John deepened, not from weather, but from shock. "How do you know my name?" Ethan motioned toward the shelter. "Come inside. This storm won't wait. I'll explain once we're out of the wind." The warmth of the fire, small though it was, dragged John closer. He followed Ethan under the rock overhang, ducking into the shallow shelter. Max stayed at his heel, eyes locked on Ethan with unwavering caution. Inside, the space held a bedroll, a pot, a tin cup, and a few practical supplies arranged with fastidious order. Whoever Ethan was, he had learned to live with very little. Ethan sat across from them, hands extended toward the fire. His fingers were long scarred and rough, proof of years of working with woodstone or survival gear. He watched the flames for a moment before speaking. "I wasn't expecting anyone to come this far into the forest, especially not in weather like this." John's tone sharpened. "You said you knew me." Ethan nodded. "Or rather, I knew your father." Thomas Harrison's name echoed loudly in John's mind. Ethan's expression softened briefly, as if recalling something painful or deeply cherished. "When I was a kid," Ethan said slowly, "I lived with my mother in a trailer near the outskirts of Duluth. My father, he wasn't around." He cleared his throat, the firelight flickering across his amber eyes. "One winter must have been 20, maybe 22 years ago, I wandered into these woods. Snowstorm hit fast. I got lost, hypothermic. Should have died out there." John's heart tightened. Ethan continued. "Your father found me. He carried me on his back through a blizzard worse than this. Saved my life. The image pierced John, his father, tall and stern, carrying a freezing boy through snow. Ethan reached into his coat and removed a folded envelope worn brittle-yellowed at the edges. Before he got me home, he pressed this into my coat pocket. Told me to keep it safe until the right person came asking. He handed it to John. His hands shook not from fear, but from something heavier. John unfolded the envelope carefully. Inside was a single slip of paper, the handwriting unmistakably his father's thick, bold strokes. If you're reading this, then you've survived what I feared most. You were always stronger than you believed. Come home. And don't let the darkness of war take the last good part of you. John stopped breathing. The shelter blurred in his vision. He read the words again, each stroke of ink pressing into old wounds he had pretended were healed. His father had written to him not a warning, not instructions, but a plea. A plea to the son he feared was slipping away. Max nudged his hand gently, as if sensing the break in him. Ethan spoke softly. I didn't know what it meant back then. But when I saw you, I recognized your face. Same eyes. Same way of carrying weight. John forced air into his lungs. Why live out here? Why not bring this to town? Ethan's gaze darkened. My past is better left outside the world. Too many things I can't fix. Too many mistakes I don't want following me. He said it with the voice of a man who had once loved something deeply enough to lose it. Before John could speak again, Max growled softly, low, tense. Ethan's head snapped toward the forest entrance. The wind parted just enough for footsteps to echo across the clearing. Slow, deliberate, not wandering, approaching. John tightened his grip on the envelope. The storm raged outside, but something colder moved through the trees, something that had followed him since the cabin. Ethan stood shoulders squared. John stood too, the words of his father heavy in his pocket. And Max, loyal as ever, positioned himself between the storm and the man he was willing to die for. The storm raged with a force that seemed almost purposeful, as if the forest itself had decided to hide its secrets under a veil of white fury. Wind clawed at the rock overhang shielding John, Ethan, and Max. Snow burst inward in swirling blasts. The fire sputtered, but held its light shaking against the dark like a fragile heartbeat. Max stood rigid at the shelter's entrance, body tense, hackles raised, staring into the storm with unblinking focus. His low growl vibrated through the small space, steady warning, ancient. John's pulse tightened. He had heard that tone in Max only twice in their 12 years together. Both times danger had been close enough to breathe on. Something's out there, Ethan murmured, rising slowly. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, deepening the sharp lines along his cheekbones. A strand of dark hair fell over his amber eyes, but he didn't bother to push it back. His posture changed, straightened, quiet, deliberate. Not the posture of a man afraid of the dark, but one who understood it. John stepped to Max's side, eyes narrowing. The wind howled again. Snow whipped into the shelter as Max suddenly barked, a thunderous, guttural sound echoing off the rock walls. Something moved in the storm. A massive silhouette glided between the trees, larger than any wolf John had ever seen, tall enough that its back nearly brushed the lower branches. A pale shape materialized from the blizzard, ghost-like at first, then unmistakably real as it came closer into the fire's thin glow. A snow wolf. A great northern wolf, its fur, pure white, thick as winter clouds, shimmering faintly against the darkness. Its eyes were pale amber, startlingly intelligent. neither hostile nor afraid. It padded toward them with measured steps, each one silent on the snow. John felt the air in the shelter shift, some mix of awe, fear, and a strange familiarity he couldn't place. Ethan inhaled sharply. "That's impossible." His voice trembled for the first time since they met. "That's a northern ghost wolf. They're nearly extinct." John whispered, "You've seen them before." Ethan nodded slowly. "Once. Years ago, when your father found me." The wolf stopped just beyond the firelight, its breath forming long streams of steam. Max didn't advance, but he didn't retreat either. The two animals locked eyes, silent ancient recognition passing between them. Not predator to prey, not challengers. Something older, something deeper. John stepped slightly forward, compelled by an instinct he didn't understand. The wolf's gaze shifted to him, and in that moment, he felt as if someone else were looking out from behind those pale eyes, someone with quiet strength and steady judgment, someone who had carried burdens in silence. Someone like his father. The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, as though confirming a memory. Ethan swallowed hard. "John, these wolves aren't supposed to come near people. They avoid us. They're shadows. But this one..." His voice softened into reverence. "It looks like it knows you." John's breath shook. Why would it? Ethan hesitated before answering. "Because your father saved one." John turned sharply. "Saved one," Ethan nodded. "He told me once, or rather I overheard him tell one of the rangers, that he cut open a hunter's trap to free a wolf. Said the animal didn't run off. It stayed. Watched him work. And after that, it kept its distance, but it kept him company." The blizzard roared outside, yet the wolf stood unmoved, as steady as the stone beneath them. John felt a warmth spread inside him, a sensation both comforting and piercing. "He never told me that," he whispered. Ethan gave him a knowing look. "Your father didn't talk about the things that mattered most. Men like him, they show loyalty instead of speaking it." Slowly, the wolf stepped closer. Max gave a quiet huff, but remained still. The wolf lowered its head, not in submission, but in recognition. John felt his chest tighten painfully. He had seen soldiers look at him like that. Men he had guided through nightmares. Men who had followed him through sandstorms and gunfire. Men who had trusted him with their last breath. This wolf, this creature of ice and silence, was offering the same wordless message. Ethan knelt slightly, speaking so softly, the storm barely carried the sound. "My mother used to tell me stories," he said. "Old northern legends. She said white wolves appear only when someone returns to the place they belong, when the forest acknowledges them." His eyes flicked toward John. "You're home, Harrison, whether you wanted to be or not." John swallowed hard around a knot of emotion. "What does it want from me?" Ethan shook his head. "Not want. Warn." As if on cue, the wolf turned its head toward the forest, toward the direction from which the earlier footsteps had approached. It emitted a deep rumbling growl, not at John, not at Max, but at the unseen watchers beyond the storm. A warning, a territorial claim, a message that something dangerous stalked the trees. John's pulse hardened. Ethan reached for a long wooden staff leaning by the shelter wall, weathered, carved by hand, with marks etched into the grain. He held it like someone who had used it before, in more than just walking. Max stepped to the entrance, every muscle coiled. John felt a sensation creep through him, ominous, electric. Something else was out there. something that had driven even a beast of winter to approach humans. The wolf turned back to John. For a moment, the blizzard seemed to quiet around them. Snowflakes slowed in the air. Sound thinned. And in that pocket of stillness, the wolf stepped forward just enough to touch its nose to the edge of John's coat. A gesture so small, yet it struck him like a memory he had forgotten he'd been waiting for. Then the wolf turned. In a single powerful leap, it vanished into the storm, white fur dissolving into white wind. The forest swallowed it whole, but its warning remained. Ethan exhaled shakily. "Your father was right," he murmured. "Some promises only soldiers understand." John tightened his grip on the envelope containing his father's message. "Someone's hunting us," he said quietly. "That wolf came to make sure we knew." Max barked once, sharp, decisive. "Not fear. Readiness." Ethan nodded grimly. "Then we can't stay here." The storm howled as if agreeing, and as John stepped out into the blizzard following Max and Ethan into the shifting white darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that another pair of eyes, amber and ancient, still watched from somewhere beyond the trees. The blizzard descended with a brutality that swallowed all sound, all shape, all sense of direction. It came down from Lake Superior like a living force howling through the frozen pines, slamming against the walls of the old cabin, and tearing at anything foolish enough to stand in its path. The temperature plunged so fast, the air itself seemed to crack. Snow flew sideways, a white curtain thick enough to blind a man even from 2 feet away. Inside the fragile wooden structure, John braced one shoulder against a wall panel that was buckling inward. The cabin had once been sturdy, but decades of abandonment had weakened its bones, and now the storm was using the wind like a battering ram. Ethan gripped the bottom plank, long fingers stiffening as he pushed with all his strength. The young man's breath came in harsh clouds mixing with the cold that bit through every layer of his clothing. His normally composed expression was cracked by the weight of fear, responsibility, and urgency. Snow clung to his dark hair, freezing into tiny white crystals. "Hold it just another second," he shouted over the storm's roar. John's back spasmed sharply. It was like someone drove a rusted nail down his spine. A groan escaped his throat before he could swallow it down. His gloved hands slipped on the icy wood. The pain radiated from his lower back, old wounds from his service years flaring to life in the worst possible moment. His legs buckled and he fell hard onto the frozen floor. Max barked sharply, the sound cutting through the chaos. The 12-year-old German shepherd rushed to John's side, paws skidding across the wood. His thick coat, black and tan, streaked with silver age, bristled with anxiety. Max nudged John's shoulder, whining, pushing his heavy body against John as if trying to lift him. I'm fine," John rasped, but the words were hollow. Ethan slammed the reinforcement bar into place with a final shove securing the panel. He spun around, eyes widening as he saw John on the floor. Ethan knelt beside him, snowflakes still clinging to his sleeves. His breath was ragged cheeks flushed from cold and fear. "Don't move. You hit the floor hard." John shook his head through clenched teeth. "It's not the fall. My back. Old injury." Ethan placed one hand gently on John's shoulder, steady but careful. "Can you feel your legs?" "I can," John answered, though the pain radiated like fire. Max pressed his warm body closer, positioning himself between John and the open drafts in the cabin wall. The dog's instincts were razor-sharp. He felt danger long before men understood it. Outside, the storm roared louder, pushing against the cabin like it wanted to tear it from the earth. Snow seeped through cracks in powdery bursts, and then a howl. low drawn out, echoing across the frozen woods. Not threatening, not angry. A warning. Max's ears shot up. Ethan stiffened. "That's the white wolf's pack," he whispered. Shadows moved outside the window, large shapes blending with the storm's rage. The wolves came silently, a circle of massive bodies, their thick white coats catching the snow like cloaks of ice. They positioned themselves around the cabin bodies, angled against the wind. Living barricades. Living shields. John's breath caught. He had seen soldiers form protective circles around wounded men in war. He had been in those circles, sweat and blood freezing into his uniform, praying they would hold the line. And now, 3 decades later, wolves stood in the same formation, holding the line for him. Ethan crawled to the woodpile, shoved more logs onto the fire, and the flames rose, sending warmth into the freezing air. He glanced back at John, expression softening. "You're lucky," he murmured. "Old wolves like Max don't leave their wounded." John gripped Max's fur. The dog's body heat seeped into him, steady, grounding, alive. "He's saved me more times than I can count." Ethan moved closer, but Max growled a quiet warning rumble, not hostile but protective. Ethan raised both hands gently. "I know, buddy. I'm not taking him away." Max lowered his head beside John's nose, touching John's cheek, breath warm against his skin. Every few seconds he nudged John, checking consciousness, checking breath, checking life. John blinked slowly, fighting the heavy pull of exhaustion. "Don't." "Let me sleep," he slurred. Ethan nodded. "I won't." "Neither will Max." The storm intensified. Snow blew under the door in thin ribbons. The entire structure shook violently, beams creaking under the strain. One window shattered inward, spraying shards of ice and glass. Ethan jumped in front of it, shielding John and Max with his body. "This storm," Ethan's voice trembled. "I've never seen one this strong." Another wolf pressed its massive body against the broken side of the cabin, blocking the wind. John exhaled shakily. "They're protecting us." Ethan glanced back at him, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Your father once said the forest watches over those it chooses." Max licked John's face again, firm, insistent. John managed a weak smile. "Good boy. I'm still here." Hours passed, but the storm only grew worse. The fire flickered as cold drafts pushed under the door. Ethan fed the flames relentlessly, his hands red and raw. Max never left John's side. He curled tightly around him, pressing his weight against John's chest, heart beating strong and steady. Every time John's breathing slowed, Max nudged him sharply with his nose. Every time John's eyelids fluttered shut, Max whined until John opened them again. Outside, the pack held their ground. Snow piled onto their backs, but they did not move. Not 1 inch. Ethan, exhausted, eventually leaned against the wall, watching John and Max with a look of something like awe. "That dog would die for you," he whispered. John's voice cracked. "So would any soldier." At some unknown hour, when the storm was at its loudest, when the cabin seemed minutes from collapse, a deep cracking sound erupted outside. A tree falling. Then another. The wolves howled, not in fear, but in warning to each other, repositioning as the storm shifted direction. Ethan braced the door with both hands. The wind screamed like something alive. John felt the world blur, cold seeping into his bones, pain overwhelming his senses. But Max pushed harder against him, the dog's warm breath anchoring John to consciousness. "Max, stay," John whispered. Max barked once, a single loyal reply. And when dawn finally broke, weak gray light pushing through the shattered window, the storm had passed. The wolves were gone. but their paw prints circled the cabin like a protective ring. John was alive, because Max had refused to leave him, because Ethan had fought the storm like a soldier, because the forest, maybe even his father's memory, had held them through the night. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind carried the hush of something sacred, like the valley itself was holding its breath. Dawn unfurled slowly over the superior forest, casting pale gold light across the snowdrifts that sparkled with untouched brilliance. The cabin creaked as it warmed under the rising sun, the frost retreating inch by inch. John sat on a rough wooden chair near the fire Ethan had stoked at first light. His back still throbbed a deep ache that pulsed with every breath. But he was upright, awake, and alive thanks to Max, whose head now rested on John's boot, as if claiming responsibility for keeping him tethered to the world. Ethan hovered near the stove, pouring hot water into 3 tin cups. His movements were careful, purposeful, no longer the detached, guarded young man who had greeted John in the woods. There was a steadiness in him now, a quiet resolution, like the storm had carved something new into the grain of his character. His dark hair, still tousled from the night, brushed against his eyebrows. His jaw was tense, but his amber eyes held warmth, something John had only seen in soldiers who finally understood they weren't fighting alone. "Drink," Ethan said softly, handing John a steaming cup. "You're gonna need your strength." John took it with stiff fingers. "That bad, huh?" Ethan allowed himself a thin smile. "You scared the hell out of me." And Max. At the sound of his name, Max thumped his tail once without lifting his head. John reached down and stroked the graying fur along the dog's neck. "Not my intention," he murmured, "but I'm still here." Ethan nodded, then glanced toward the door. Outside, faint but unmistakable, were the paw prints of the wolves, their circle still visible, perfectly preserved where the storm had stopped just hours before. John followed his gaze. "They didn't have to help us." "No," Ethan murmured, "but they did. Your father must have earned something rare out here." "Respect." John's throat tightened, not with pain, but something older. Something that had waited 30 years for a moment like this. By noon, after gathering their strength and patching what they could of the battered cabin, the 3 began their trek back toward Duluth. The forest was unrecognizable, glittering, silent, transformed. Max walked ahead, paws sinking into the snow, with slow confidence. Ethan walked beside John, ready to catch him if his back betrayed him again. The air smelled of pine and clean, cold water. For the first time since his return to this land, John felt like each step was leading him back towards something rather than away from it. By the time they reached the outskirts of Duluth, the winter sun was high enough to reflect off Lake Superior in sheets of blinding silver. The lake stretched endlessly, its surface frozen over, except for a narrow strip of dark, restless water, churned by the wind. John stopped at the overlook, his breath hanging in a long white cloud. Here, this place, this view, this cold bite in the air, it all belonged to a childhood he had abandoned too soon. He stood still for a long time, Max leaning against his leg, Ethan watching from a few steps away, giving him space. The wind stung his cheeks, the lake glittered, and something inside him let go. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled with a tremor that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. "He wanted me to come back," John whispered. "Not for the land, for myself." Ethan stepped up beside him. "Your father knew something about you, something you weren't ready to see." John looked at the young man, and for the first time truly understood how lost Ethan must have been all these years, living alone in the woods, carrying unsaid things like anchors tied around his ribs. "You're coming with me," John said suddenly, the decision effortless. Ethan blinked. What? Back to the house? To fix it? To build something better, something that matters? Ethan hesitated, his shoulders tensing, with an old instinct to reject kindness before it could hurt him. John, John said softly. I don't want charity either. Never have. But I know what it feels like to be adrift. And I know what it feels like to be found. You deserve a place to land. And I think my father wanted me to offer that to someone. Someone like you. Ethan's jaw-clenched eyes glistening not with tears, but with a fragile, unspoken relief. He nodded once. Then I'll stay. They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a full and grounded silence, the kind shared by soldiers who understand each other without words. When they reached the Harrison house, the sun was already beginning its descent behind the icy roofs of Duluth. The old home still leaned tiredly to one side, its porch sagging windows cracked paint peeling. But to John, it no longer looked like a grave. It looked like a beginning. Max padded onto the porch and curled up next to the front step as if he had been guarding that place his entire life. John walked to the battered wooden post beside the door, once the proud mark of his family's home, later abandoned and forgotten. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small wooden sign he had carved during long nights in the cabin. Ethan watched as John wiped away decades of dust and splinters from the post. Then he lifted the sign, hands steady despite the tremor of his muscles. The letters were carved deep and sure: Harrison Haven, a place for those who fought. John bolted it into place. Max gave a soft bark of approval. Ethan breathed out slowly, as if witnessing the moment he had secretly needed for years. John stepped back, examining the sign as the winter light washed over it. And in that moment, he didn't feel like a man who had returned to face ghosts. He felt like a man finally walking out of the shadows. This was his father's final message. Not guilt, not regret. A mission. A home for the lost. A sanctuary for the wounded. A place where neither men nor dogs who once fought would ever have to fight alone again. And as Max rested his head on John's foot, eyes shining with the same faith he had carried through storms, battles, and long, silent years, John whispered, "We're home. All of us." In the end, John learned that miracles don't always arrive as thunder in the sky or angels in glowing robes. Sometimes they come quietly through an old dog who refuses to leave your side, through a stranger who becomes family, or through the whisper of a father's love carried on the winter wind. Some would say it was luck that saved John that night. Others would call it instinct or the loyalty of a good dog. But those who have lived through storms, both the ones outside and the ones inside, know better. They know that sometimes God sends help in forms we don't expect: a warm presence in the cold, a guiding animal, a memory that returns exactly when we need it. And perhaps the greatest miracle is this: after 30 long years, John finally found his way home, not through strength, but through grace. May this story remind us that no matter how lost we feel, no matter how heavy the past becomes, there is always a path back to the light. Sometimes we just need the courage to take the first step, and the faith that God will send the right companions to walk beside us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are not alone. Leave a comment telling us what part moved you the most, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, redemption, and second chances. May God bless you, guide you, and protect you today, tomorrow, and in every storm you face.